This is a Momentum Media production.
The SMSF Advisor Show. Your expert insights into the biggest themes shaping the SMSF advice industry.
Hi everyone and welcome to the SMSF Advisor Show. I'm Miranda Brownlee and I'm joined by my co-host Aaron Dunn. Hi Aaron.
Hi Miranda, how are you?
I'm good, and you?
Not too bad, a little bit exhausted. I've been on the road for the past week or so with our SMSF Day events in Adelaide and Perth. It's been great to get out and about, and a lot of discussion naturally happening around the government's announcement previously on that $3 million threshold for an additional tax. So that's kind of been front and centre in everyone's mind. So it doesn't surprise me at all that we'll be talking about this for much of the rest of the year, I reckon.
Yes, I think it's just going to be an ongoing topic, and I'm sure there's been a lot of discussions.
Yeah.
And it's certainly still been in the news as well. So we have, say, the SMSF Association, for example, put together a working group on this, as there will be quite a bit of advocacy work to do with this, given all the different sort of areas it impacts. And we're also seeing sort of the objective of super consultation unfold. Obviously, that's come to an end now, and seen already a few people sort of raise issues or perhaps question sort of the need to have an objective. I think it'll get quite a mixed response, probably, this particular legislation.
Yeah, so the objective of super, as we know, the federal government said they really want to bed that down prior to the budget, and therefore some other policy decisions that we may likely there see follow that thereafter. So, as you said, the SMSF Association is formulating a group. Why? We know there is consultation. We know we have more unanswered questions that we do than answered questions. I know at our SMSF Day events, we've been raising issues around pensions and insurance and LRBAs for TSB purposes and a whole raft of stuff that as an industry, we need to keep drawing these issues out to understand them. And we're not going to be in a position like we were with some of the super reforms where we're still trying to tidy up some loose ends with things like market-linked pensions and the like. We know that there are defined benefit pensions. The government hadn't even really given a thought to those sorts of things. And at least, subject to how this all rolls out, 1 July 2025, seems like a long time away, but it probably isn't in hindsight. So, we need to get together as a profession, identify what these issues might look like, advocate pretty strongly for some change where we deem it to be necessary, and then come up with something, if it is going to proceed, that is more workable than it potentially is in its current form.
Yeah, and given they have said that they really want to move quite fast on the legislation, it is important to sort of raise the issues now before we end up with an unworkable law that isn't really practical.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also on the political front, we've also seen Labor look to enshrine the superannuation guarantee into the employment standards. Basically just give people who are not covered by some of the more standard or modern employment contracts, they'll have more power to be able to chase super that they're missing, that they haven't been paid.
Yeah, so again, this, as you said, is extending sort of the framework that exists at the moment. And whilst the ATO has certain powers, the intention of this is to naturally complement those powers and give as strong a possible protection as they can for employees against those that have unpaid super. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the unpaid super I saw for lost workers is somewhere around $3.4 billion in unpaid super, which is staggering. And that, I think, was 1920 off the top of my head. But in Labor's view, that's clearly not good enough, and therefore a much tighter arrangement for those that are avoiding those obligations they see as necessary. So we'll continue to watch what happens there, and ultimately we'll see some amendments to the law to incorporate these far more stringent measures.
We've also seen another lost deed case, which was in Victoria, which basically involved missing deed for a discretionary trust, and sort of has implications for SMSFs that lose their trust deed, that they might be able to go through the courts and resolve the situation as the trustee did in this particular case.
So, Miranda, I reckon there's an inference here being made by SMSF Advisory, because this is the second one in Victoria about lost trustees. So we did see the Alistair one not that long ago as well in Victoria's Supreme Court case, where we needed to see whether the trustee was on foot, and therefore the question of the binding nomination being in place. And again, this one here is a discretionary trust. And again, we're going back some time into the 1970s. And therefore, in a similar vein, looking at the realities of, with the lost deed, whether we have what we have on foot or not. And I guess the context of SMSFs, in what form may deeds be acceptable? What happens if someone dies? What happens when deeds are lost? And therefore, how do we go about a process to make sure that these are on foot? And I guess, cut a long story short, we just need to make sure we're spending the time and energy and effort to make sure that that chain of documents is in order. And if we have that chain of documents, we're limiting the risks and potentially the need to have to go to the Supreme Court to get orders or consents from the court as to how trustees may be able to deal with certain actions.
Yeah. And the other issue that we've sort of seen raised recently, which I think may have been also discussed by the association a few weeks ago, is just this issue around, with the changes to the work test, there has been a small part of the definition of employee lost in terms of that extended definition that exists under the SIS regulations hasn't been carried into the Tax Act, which means there may actually be some employees that now cannot make non-concessional contributions that would have previously been able to before July last year.
Yeah, so remembering that from 1 July last year, we did see that shift move from the SIS regs into Section 29165 of the Tax Act. And so the concern here is that this amendment has now failed to capture people covered under the extended definition of an employee. And as a result, it appears that the ATO has confirmed that clients in this age group who may have previously been eligible to claim a deduction for those contributions due to being captured by what was that extended or expanded definition will now be prevented from doing so, as their duties actually no longer count towards being gainfully employed. So this includes company directors, as the courts have defined a director here to be an office holder of a company and not an employee of a company. So very technical, but if you want to find out more, again, I know, Miranda, there was an article that was published recently, which is why we're talking about it, and you can find out more about that, where Craig Day sort of mapped out a lot of the technical issues in respect to that definition change from the SIS Act across to the Income Tax Assessment Act.
Yeah, and I think he's written an extended sort of piece on that as well, if you have clients impacted by that issue.
Yeah.
So we're now going to be joined by the ATO shortly, who's going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into both their annual statistics and some of the more recent statistics for SMSFs, taking us through some of the trends that are happening in the SMSF sector and what this kind of means for the industry. So we're now joined by Martin Frauenfelder, Director of the ATO SMSF Regulatory Branch. Hi, Martin. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Miranda. It's good to be here.
So we recently saw the ATO release the annual data for SMSFs based on those 2020-21 returns, which is obviously the most accurate set of data we have. There's also some more recent data for registrations and that kind of thing. So we just wanted to ask you today about some of the trends you're seeing. In particular, there has been a little bit of a shift, I guess, in some age groups. What are some of the trends you're seeing in the growth of certain age groups and perhaps younger people registering, setting up SMSFs?
Well, I think overall people are more engaged or at least aware of their super. And as a result, we're seeing younger people getting involved in SMSFs. In the last 5 years, for example, we've seen the average age of new members drop from around 48 to 46.5 years. In 2021, around 64% of all new members were under 50 years old. So within this group, we saw a lot of activity in the 35 to 44 age group. And these individuals made up 34% of all new members, which is up from around 29% 5 years ago. Taking everything into account, it probably makes sense that this age group has the most activity, as they're the ones that are likely to have the stable jobs, plus have built up enough super to roll into an SMSF, which in 2021 was on average 399,000 collectively. Those 60 or over only made up around 10% of new registrations, which has been pretty steady for the last few years, although it was as high as 14% 5 years ago. Overall, though, the average age of the total population is getting older each year. Our last annual overview shows that the average age of all SMSF members now sits at 61, and that's up from 58% in 2018. When comparing the percentage of members in each age bracket over the last 5 years, you can see a reduction of less than 1% up to the age of 69. However, this trend is reversed from age 70, where the average of each age bracket increased by anything up to 1.6 each year. So this is particularly prevalent in the 75 to 84 age bracket, which has grown by around 50%, from 9.3 to 14.2%, and the 85 plus bracket, which has doubled from 1.5 to 3%. But keep in mind that starting at such a low base, it's easier to get greater movement. So a lot of people have been in the sector for a long time and they are getting older. And this is why we don't see the small percentage of younger members having an impact on the broader population.
So I'm interested to know, I guess we are naturally therefore seeing the highest rate of establishments, therefore, I think you said in that 35 to 45 sort of age bracket. What are some of the issues or considerations that you see each age group needs to consider? That to me, I think, is quite a fascinating insight into the broad demographic of the sector, insofar that the challenges of our 70-plus-year-old clients are very different to those that may be 35 and entering the system for the very first time.
Yeah, it is a good question. And I think there's a couple of things that trustees need to consider, but regardless of their age. So firstly, I suppose our key message or consideration that we're trying to convey is whether an SMSF is the right retirement vehicle for them. And that's regardless of whether they're coming into the sector or whether they're existing. Ideally, this is discussed when the SMSF is being set up and reviewed as circumstances change throughout the lifetime of the fund. Particularly as trustees become older, it's extremely important this is talked about, so an appropriate exit plan is put in place. Unfortunately, we see a lot of cases where one member of a two-member fund has passed away and they were the active member of the fund. So the remaining member, who has never really had much to do with the fund, gets left to make all the decisions. It's not just planning for the death of the member either. Running an SMSF takes time and effort, and people's circumstances change. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is there are a number of reasons why an SMSF may no longer be right for the individual, and you never know when the unexpected may occur. Therefore, it's never too early to have the conversation and to be prepared. And we do have a number of publications on our website that talk about doing this when setting up and managing your fund. Another key message is you can't take money out of the fund for personal use before you meet a condition of release. In most instances, this is when you reach your preservation age of 60 and retire, or 65 even if you don't retire. And there are some other conditions that qualify. It is illegal to access your super before you meet one of these conditions, and you can face significant penalties, including paying additional income tax returns on the amounts illegally accessed, penalties and interest, and being disqualified, which can impact your professional career. So be aware of anyone who promotes a scheme that talks about getting early access to your super. And I suppose the last thing I'll mention is the need to have a good investment strategy. And again, it doesn't matter if you're younger or older, you need to have one of these. The development and review of a strategy should consider issues such as diversification or lack of, investment returns, and how the investments will achieve the members' retirement goals. And particularly as members get close to retirement, they need to consider things like the liquidity of the fund's assets, the fund's ability to pay benefits and other costs, and whether the fund should hold insurance for each member. So not really relevant to age groups, but certainly things that members need to consider throughout the life cycle of a SMSF.
Yeah, and we've seen to that extent the ATO take a much more I don't use the word forceful approach, but they've been more deliberate in their actions in terms of disqualifying trustees in recent times. We've seen that, and I know, Miranda, you and I have spoken about it a lot on here. The number of disqualified trustees is certainly much larger in the last 18 months than we've ever seen previously. And that, therefore, is a reflection of how, as a regulator, you need to manage risk around those that are coming into the system and for what reasons they might be coming into the system. And that, therefore, poses some challenges on, making sure that those that are coming through the front door are coming through for the very right reasons.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the other sorts of areas that I guess there has been a shift a little bit, I know that research firms like Investment Trends have sort of pointed this out, is that SMSF trustees are not necessarily using an accountant or an advisor to set up their SMSF, but doing it themselves rather than going through a professional. What kind of shift have you seen there? Is there more SMSF setting it up through their own, setting it up without an accountant or an advisor?
Yeah, the figures weak. So I suppose to start with, we don't collect data on whether new members talk to a financial advisor before setting up an SMSF. However, we do know that 85% of funds are set up through a registered agent. So this is up from around 75% in 2018. So it is increasing. And around 85% of those funds also have a corporate trustee, which has been slowly climbing over the last few years. So that in itself suggests that the majority are talking to tax professionals before they set one up.
Yep.
Just on the establishments, we know that SMSF, it's a robust sector. There's around 600, well, there's just over 600,000 funds now, 1.1 million. And it's the second largest superannuation fund type by value behind industry funds. So SMSFs hold $868 billion, industry funds hold $1 trillion. So there is a lot of money there. So, that figure is growing by around 1.5% each year. If you look at registrations by financial year, our December quarterly statistics show that 28,000 funds registered in 2022, up from around 26 in 2021 and 25 in 2018. If you look at calendar year, though, it provides a slightly different picture. And I know there are some media articles out there that sort of interchange. So some will look at a financial year, others look at a calendar year. So by calendar year, there were 25,000 funds registered in 22, and that was down from nearly 30,000 in 2021, but up from 22,000 the year before. And that's mainly so the difference is due to a big jump in registrations in the September and December 2021 quarters. So out of interest, our highest registration was in 2007, where 45,000 funds were registered, followed by 39,000 in 2013.
So I guess we're getting a far more consistent sort of run rate now. Yes, that we're going to see what I'd call some outliers about those, and the ATO will risk assess, what are the outliers. But I think conceptually, a couple of the stats that you said in there, to me, I think augur well for the industry when you made reference to 85% actually end up going through a tax agent. So there is a professional level of input there. And the corporate trustee structure, again, like you rightly said, the benefits around a corporate trustee versus an individual trustee have been known for some time now. And therefore, those two things collectively probably suggest that sort of mid 20,000 run rate is probably a fair representation of where we'll be each and every year.
Yeah, I think so. That's what the data is showing us.
Yep.
And we also know the ATO has been doing some research on specific subgroups within the SMSF population, such as small business owners, for example. Can you share any insights with us on some of the characteristics of each of those subgroups and perhaps how contraventions compare against across those different groups?
Yeah, I can. And we are really excited about this work, this research, because it is giving us a better understanding of the population and identifying ways we can help and support the sector. So our preliminary analysis shows around 45% of funds are linked to small business, 30% to individuals not in business, and the remaining 25% linked to private wealthy groups. The analysis is ongoing, but we can already see differences in the compliance behaviours for these segments. So, for instance, we have found higher rates of non-lodgement and loans to related parties for those funds with members operating a small business. There also appears to be a higher proportion of individuals entering the system for the purpose of illegally accessing their super, as this group tends to be targeted by promoters. Also, inappropriate tax planning arrangement involving SMSFs are more common where fund members are part of a private and wealthy group. So that's some of the stuff that we're starting to see already.
So interestingly, out of that then, how do the contraventions actually compare when you look into those different groups?
So other than the general findings that I've sort of just gone over, we're still reconciling this data against the different subgroups. But I want to state that overall, we find the sector is really compliant. The overall contravention rate is still less than 4%. We know that loans, in-house assets and separation of assets continue to be the most commonly reported contraventions. Unfortunately, less than half of the contraventions we receive are unrectified, although we are starting to see this improving, but clearly there is a lot more work to do. Now, a contravention isn't necessarily a bad thing. Where an auditor picks up an issue, the trustees are made aware and have an opportunity to rectify it. And we encourage trustees to work with their professionals to rectify these as soon as possible. But as I said, we're still looking into these subgroups and sort of looking at where we can help and support the industry.
Excellent. Well, Martin, thank you. I know this is part one of a two-part series that we're doing with the ATO around these annual statistical summaries that come out each and every year. And I think, having seen these for many years, I think the amount of work that goes into these over a long period of time and the intelligence that not only you get as a regulator out of the data, but what we get as an industry, I think you certainly should be applauded for the work. And I do thank you for your time today just to share, I guess, in the first instance, some of those statistical insights at a trustee level, and look forward to you joining us for part two, where we take a look at some of the professionals and the insights that we got out of this year's SMSF statistics. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Aaron. Pleasure.
So that was some really interesting insights that Martin had to share there. And if you'd like to hear part two of our series, which is going to be focused on SMSF professionals, that'll be coming out again on next week. And he'll be sharing all the trends that are happening with auditors and tax agents and the SMSF industry providers themselves.
So excellent. Thank you once again for joining us for our SMSF Advisor Show. We look forward to you joining us for our next episode. Take care and bye for now.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.